Hi, I'm Nick Rains from Leica Camera Australia. This is the Leica D-Lux 8. I'm going to go through all of the menu items and I'm going to show you what changes I would make so that the camera works for me the way I like it. Okay, let's turn the camera on and get going. Okay, one of the first things that you'll notice is that the shutter speed dial on the top here and the aperture dial on the lens here are both set to A. I will almost always put the aperture ring onto 1.7 or whatever other aperture I choose rather than using A on both, which puts the camera into program mode. So that's the first thing I'll do. Okay, let's go through the menus and I'm going to show you what the camera is set to out of the factory, which is what you can see on the back here, and then what changes I'm going to make. All right, so let's get going. This is the basic quick menu, the home screen if you want to call it that. That's what you see when you first press the menu button. If you press the menu button a second time, you go to the first page of the deeper menu items, and then each time you continue to press the menu button, you'll see that we step through each of the different menu screens. So it's like a quick way of getting to a certain page in the screens. Obviously, you can also use the down arrow and go off the bottom of the page. Or what I sometimes do is when I go to the first page is I go up, and that takes me to the last menu item on the last page. So it scrolls through it like in a loop. So it's useful to know that. So let's start with page 1 of the menus. I'll come back to the home screen later and explain what that is showing you. All right, drive mode. I generally shoot with the camera on single frame. You can, of course, go into that menu and change to a whole bunch of different speeds of shooting. You've got 2 frames per second, 7 frames per second, 11 frames per second. You've got interval shooting for doing time lapses, and you've got exposure bracketing. So I would normally shoot on single. Occasionally, I do shoot exposure brackets. So let's go down to this item here, click the right button to open up the options, and by default you've got plus and minus 1 EV and 3 exposures. My preference here would be to go to 5 shots at a total spread of plus and minus 2. So you've got 0, plus 1 and plus 2, minus 1 and minus 2. Now, I would prefer to do 3 shots at plus and minus 2, but unfortunately the camera doesn't offer that option. So 5 shots at a maximum of plus and minus 2 gives you exactly the same result. You just get 2 more pictures. Then you've got the automatic setting below there. Just click that to register it. Automatic means that it shoots the whole sequence in one go with one press of the shutter button. You don't have to take each picture one at a time. If you want to do that, you could turn off automatic, but it's so much easier just to shoot the whole sequence with one press of the button. Okay, back to the menu, back to drive mode, and you'll see that that is now set to exposure bracketing. You would have to go back into that menu item and come back to single if you wanted to go back to single shooting. So don't forget you've shot it, otherwise you'll get another sequence of exposure brackets. You could assign that function to a custom button, and we'll come back to custom buttons in a short while. Next option down, and interestingly enough, the self-timer has been removed from the drive mode menu. On some other Leica cameras, the self-timer is actually within the drive mode menu, which means it's very hard to do an exposure bracket with the self-timer, which is something I often do for landscape photography. On the D-Lux 8, the self-timer is now on its own menu, which is wonderful. Opening that up, we've got a 2 and a 12-second option. So I'm going to leave that off for the time being, but that's what it's for. Focusing options. We have by default intelligent AF, and that is supposed to pick the focusing mode based on the subject. I prefer to choose it myself, so I'm going to change that to AFS, which is single shot. I rarely use tracking modes on cameras. I prefer to use single shots, but that is more to do with the sorts of things I shoot rather than any lack of ability of the camera. I tend to shoot things that don't move very quickly, so I like to use single shot. By all means use continuous, and the tracking function does work quite well. So that's AFS. Then you have the AF mode, and there's quite a few of these, starting with multi-field, and this is where the camera chooses the focus point for you, and I'm not a big fan of that. I want you to choose the focus point because it's very important that you decide what is the most important point of the picture and make sure that's sharp. So spot gives you a tiny little X to focus on, and field gives you a box. Now, I use field for just about everything. I rarely use spot, and field seems to cover 99% of all eventualities. You also have zone focusing, which is a series of boxes in the middle of the frame, or little crosses I should say. That seems to work best when you're using autofocus continuous. So if you are tracking something, AFC and zone seems to give me the best results, and this is true across all the Leica cameras as well. My SL3 works superbly for birds in flight using a long lens when I'm using that zone focusing with AFC. You have tracking, which is a little bit the naming of it's a little bit unfortunate. That tends to track things across the frame rather than forwards and backwards. You lock something on, and if something's moving in a relatively slow manner, it will keep the focus on that subject. But if you want to have something tracking, if you want to track something that's moving quickly, you're better off with AFC and zone focusing. Then of course you've got eye and face, and that does pick up the eyes really nicely. So if you're shooting portraits, use that mode. But personally, I use field and I leave it there 99% of the time. And if I need to focus somewhere that's not in the center of the picture, I will tend to focus, half press the button, hold that, recompose. It's a habit that dies very hard. I've been doing it for decades, that particular technique. You could use the arrow buttons to move the focusing point first and then half press to focus, but I prefer to focus and then recompose. I find it very quick and easy. If you are doing portraits and somebody's not in the center of the picture, you could use the eye tracking as well. That works really well. Focus aid, auto magnification. So when you actually focus the lens in manual mode, it will zoom to give you a focusing window so you can see critically whether you're sharp or not. And you have an AF assist lamp, which I will leave on so that when it's in the dark, it shines a little light on the subject so that it illuminates enough for the autofocus mechanism to work. Okay, focus aid, touch AF. Now I'm going to turn this off because I find that my fingers or my nose tends to move the focusing point on the LCD screen, and it's not uncommon for me to lift the camera to my eye and find that the focusing point is somewhere in the corners and I have to bring it back to the middle. Again, this is just me. You may love the idea of touch focus on the rear screen, but I use the camera to my eye rather than looking at the screen like you would hold a phone. I find holding the camera up a lot more stable, and again, it's a habit. Feel free to do it however works for you, but I prefer to use the viewfinder and I prefer to have the touch AF off. All right, it's focusing, exposure metering, by default set to multi-field, leave that alone. Use spot if you know how to use it, but spot metering is dangerous if you don't know how to use it. So if in doubt, use multi-field and judge your histogram in the viewfinder for your exposure. Okay. Exposure compensation. This is something that this dial on the top right hand corner is set to by default. So rather than set exposure compensation in the menus, you simply need to dial this dial here. And if I just come out of the menus for a sec, you should see as I dial that dial, at the bottom of the screen you'll see the little exposure neutral marker moving plus and minus. This is really, really good design. It makes it incredibly easy because this is on tap all the time, and I use exposure compensation all the time for my exposures because I shoot in aperture priority and exposure compensation just to adjust based on the subject. So back into the menus, exposure compensation. Then we've got auto ISO. Now I've got auto ISO set here, well, turned on, and that's again the default. But if we are going to use auto ISO, we have to go to the next menu item and check the auto ISO settings. So let's click into there. And what we want to do here is set the maximum ISO to the maximum possible, which is 25,000. And then the shutter speed limit we want to leave on auto, because that sets the lower shutter speed that the camera will go to before the ISO starts to go up. And there's absolutely no point in not using the full range of ISOs, even if you go up to 25,000, because I would rather have a sharp image that's noisy than a noiseless image which isn't sharp, because I can do something about the noise, but I can't do anything about an unsharp picture due to camera shake. So I will tend to set that to 25,000 and leave that shutter speed limit on auto. If you want to, you can set it to a specific shutter speed. If you want to make sure that your camera shake is almost impossible to happen, you might set it to a 250th. That will be the minimum shutter speed that the camera uses, and then the ISO will go up from that point. So leaving it on auto does change that lower shutter speed based on the zoom length of the lens. So if you're at 75mm, you'll find it uses a slightly higher shutter speed. When you're at 24, it's slightly lower. Up to you how you use it. Just be aware of how auto ISO works. All right, white balance, set to auto white balance. I tend to use auto white balance manually. I tend to use it on daylight most of the time. I'm shooting raw almost all the time. I can change the white balance later with no cost, so it's not really a big deal. It does affect how the image looks in the viewfinder and on the back of the camera on the screen here, but you're not really locking yourself into a white balance position if you use raw, because you can change it later. So I will take that to auto white balance. File format, I tend to shoot only raw files, so I will set that to DNG. I don't have a great deal of use for JPEGs in camera. I would much rather use Lightroom to do my post-processing and then export JPEGs later for use by a client or for social media, whatever. So I want to capture maximum possible image quality, so I will shoot DNG only. JPEG settings. Now this is an interesting one because this does allow you to set the camera into a kind of black and white mode. So if I go down to film style and set that right the way down the bottom to black and white high contrast or monochrome high contrast, if I come out of the menus now, you'll see that that is now a black and white image. Now you are capturing a raw file, you are capturing all the color information, but now the viewfinder is set to black and white. And if you were shooting JPEGs, you would get black and white JPEGs. So if you want to do some black and white photography, this is a great way of previewing what your image might look like when you've actually processed it. But you will capture all the color information if you shoot DNG. So you're not really losing anything there. You're keeping all your doors open. Let's put that back to normal. Standard, there we go. Now you can adjust these, but they only affect JPEGs, remember, they do not affect RAW files. The only settings that affect RAW files on this camera are your ISO, your shutter speed and your aperture, nothing else. None of the sharpness settings, none of the looks, nothing. RAW means the data straight out of the camera as it's captured. Highlight shadow, same thing. This does not affect raw files. This actually works really well. It does give you the option to boost your shadows and pull your highlights down in high contrast situation, but it only works on JPEGs, and I don't shoot JPEGs, so I'm going to leave this on default. Same with intelligent dynamic range, leave it on auto, only affects JPEGs. Scene mode, I leave that on PASM, which means the camera is in program, aperture priority, shutter priority or manual mode. You can, if you want to, go into certain other modes, portrait, landscapes and night scenery. Frankly, I would far rather control the camera myself, and I don't use those modes, and I'm going to leave that on default. Optical image stabilizer, I'm just going to change that from panning mode to on fully, so that reduces any vibration of the camera in both axes, not just panning but also vibrating this way. So let's use it fully. Set that on. Shutter type hybrid, so it's mechanical shutter up to a certain point and then an electronic shutter at the very highest shutter speeds. Leave that on default. Flash settings, now there is a little flash which comes with this camera. This allows you to set slow sync, which means that you can use a very slow shutter speed and fire the flash to blur movement, but use the flash to freeze the movement at the same time. And you get an interesting hybrid of movement and frozen image, something I've addressed in one of the other videos associated with this camera on the Leica website. You can set the flash exposure compensation independently of the overall exposure compensation, so you can balance your ambient and your flash exposure to get a good result. This is very sophisticated and can be very effective, and again, I've addressed that in one of the other videos about the operation of the camera that you'll find on the Leica website. Okay, exposure preview. This is again the same as all of the other Leica cameras in the range. This allows you to turn off the exposure preview for manual if you were using this camera in the studio with studio lights, which I would say is highly unlikely. That's not what this camera is designed for. So leave that on PASM. Auto review is off. That is where I will leave it. This means that the camera does not show you an image on the rear screen or in the viewfinder immediately after you've shot it. Noise reduction for long exposures, leave that on, just like all the other Leica cameras. This takes a second exposure when you do a normal exposure of about 2 seconds or longer. That becomes an exposure with the shutter curtain down. That means that the two images can be subtracted from one another and the noise tends to cancel out. It's a very effective noise reduction technique for very, very long exposures. But the problem is, of course, you have to wait X amount of seconds before you can take another picture. So if you're doing a 30-second exposure, you would have to wait 30 more seconds. So you have to judge whether it's worth it or not. Slightly higher quality versus the inconvenience of waiting, or a little bit of extra noise, which you can possibly deal with later in post, but the ability to shoot immediately, up to you. I'm going to leave that on for the time being. Thumb wheel. This allows it to behave differently in different circumstances. If you are in manual mode, this will become an ISO dial, but I'm going to set it to exposure compensation, and that's where I leave it, because I very, very rarely shoot in manual these days. So exposure compensation fixed on that thumb dial means I never forget what it's for, and then your muscle memory starts to take over and you can instinctively change things. When you have different functions behaving differently depending on different circumstances, it gets very confusing. I want the camera to work one way all the time. So let's leave that one alone. User profile, you have the option to set your camera up, much like I'm doing now, and then save that as a user profile. And I think there's 3 of them here. The other Leicas have 5, but I haven't only ever used 1, so 3 or 5 makes no difference to me. Save this when you've finished setting up your camera. The other thing is that when you do a firmware update, it's very useful to have a user profile saved, because you can copy it onto your memory card, do the firmware update, and then copy it back onto your camera, and your camera is now back where you left it, rather than everything being back at factory default. Capture assistance, this is what shows in the viewfinder and on the LCD screen. So you've got grids, you've got zebra stripes, you've got level gauge, you've got histogram, and you've got clipping. What this shows is, well, it's fairly self-explanatory. I'm going to turn them all on so we can see. Now, if I come back out of the menus, you'll see that there's the level isn't going to work because the camera's facing down, but there's your grid, and there's the histogram in the left-hand corner. The zebra and the clipping is interesting because that gives you the flashing highlights to show where your exposure is. I tend to set my exposure based on flashing highlights. So if important highlights, like for instance on my forehead about there's a highlight because of the light shining on it, that's an important highlight. You would not want that to be flashing because that would be clipped. So I will tend to let the meter give me my best guess, and then if I've got flashing highlights that are important, I'll back off the exposure using the exposure compensation dial, and then my exposure is almost by definition perfect. Display settings, those can all stay on default. You might want to change the frame rate to 60. It just looks a tiny bit smoother. It's a very good viewfinder. I really find it difficult to see the difference between these two settings, but in theory 60 should be better if you've got quickly moving subjects. Okay, Leica photos, that's fairly obvious. You turn that on when you want to connect the camera to Leica photos. Format storage, yes or no, that's for formatting your cards. Camera settings. Now you can change the structure of the file name convention. This is L followed by 5 numerals starting at 00001. So that gives you 99,999 image names before it will recycle. That's quite a lot of pictures. But if you want to put your name in here or something that means something to you, you can actually edit that to put your initials or whatever you want to do. I just leave it where it is because I do all of my renaming in Lightroom later on. Reset image numbering back to 0. Again, I do my numbering later on in Lightroom, so you can leave that alone. Power saving by default is 2 minutes. If you're shooting video and if you're using some sort of mains adapter or something to shoot video, you might want to turn these to never or off so that it never actually powers down. But most of the time you probably want to leave that set to something so that if you leave the camera alone, it's not going to just flatten the batteries. So for certain settings, time lapses for instance, the camera might be running for an hour, you would want to turn these off, but let's just put it back to the default of 2 minutes. That's where I leave it most of the time. Camera information is your firmware. And if you want to add firmware here, you get the option to check the install version. And if there is a firmware version on the card and you go through this menu, it will see that. But most of the time I will update my firmware through the Photos app. So this is really not that useful if you're going to use that method. Language, you can change it to any language, and then obviously reset camera puts the whole camera back to factory default. Well, that is the menus. There's not that many of them. And one of the really cool things about this camera is that these menus are identical in design to the other cameras in the Leica range. So if you ever move to another camera in the range, or you have multiple cameras, it's really, really easy to work with different cameras. It feels and looks totally familiar. All the options are called the same names. All of the options have the same functions. It's a wonderful consistency across all of the cameras. The last thing I want to do before we finish this video is just demonstrate these custom buttons, because there are 3 of them on this camera. 4 actually, I tell a lie. There's a button underneath the exposure compensation dial, and if I hold that down, I'll just come out of the menus. There we go. If I hold that down now, long hold that is, you'll see that there's a whole range of options that you can set that to do. And this is the button in the middle of the dial, not the dial itself. The dial itself is exposure compensation, but I have this button in the middle of it set to ISO, and that's the factory default. That is a really good way to work, because you can simply tap that button in the middle of the dial there to access your ISO menu when you're shooting. And you can see the options in the viewfinder. It's really, really good, so you can leave that one alone. The other 2 buttons on the back here, the left-hand button changes the priority for the viewfinder. That's EVF, LCD, or auto. And when it's on auto, it flicks between the 2 depending on whether you're holding it to your eye or not. I find that you could use this for something else, and again, hold it down and you get lots of options. So this is something that I would leave to you to decide exactly what you want to do with it. You might want to use it to, let me see what would be good. AF on, you could use it as a sort of back button focusing if you wanted to work that way. So it would toggle on the autofocus. Personally, I leave it where it was. Let's come back to EV and LCD. The right hand custom button by default switches to video mode, and you know you're in video mode because you have the microphone levels gauge going up and down. So that is very obvious, and then toggles back again. Really useful because you can toggle between video and stills incredibly quickly, and it remembers the video settings and the still settings separately. So when you go from one to the other, you're not maintaining the same shutter speed, etc., which is exactly the way you should be using the camera. You'll have your video settings will be different to your still photography settings. So once you've got your menus all set up, you'll probably find that you don't really need to access them that often, because you have access to a lot of the options through the home screen, which is the screen you see when you first press the menu button. So that's the first press, and the second press takes you to the deeper menus. So this allows you to change, for instance, the AFS or AFC, autofocus continuous, autofocus single, the metering, the drive mode, the JPEG settings, the film style, which is on standard, the metering mode, the white balance, JPEG or DNG. This one is for turning on photos. And then the last one takes you to the menus. The rest of the display is showing you just information about what you've got set on the camera. So right now it's set to auto ISO. Shutter speed is calculated automatically because we're in aperture priority, and the aperture is set to f1.7. If I dial in some exposure compensation, you should see when I come back to there, this is now set to +1. So I'll just come out of the menus, click that back. Oops, I've got to come out of the menus to do that. Let's reset that, and now it's back at 0 again. So that's just a shortcut to a bunch of familiar and most used settings. And then lastly, on just to the right of the AVF, you'll see a little dial. This is to adjust the diopter of the viewfinder magnification on the left here. So what I tend to do is I prefer to use a camera without my reading glasses. I'll take my glasses off, I will look through the camera, and what I'm aiming to do is adjust this little dial so that the letters and numbers around the outside, so the menu options, look sharp. Not the image itself. What you want is the actual screen to look sharp that you're looking at. And the best way to judge that is to look at the numbers and the letters, adjust the dial till it's crisp and then leave it alone. And that will give you the best results. Don't forget to adjust that because you will find it makes life a lot easier. All right, that is the camera in a nutshell. Hopefully that's useful. There's not that many changes that we've made to the defaults. So enjoy using this lovely little camera.